I'm Douglas Mason, CEO of Naturally Splendid, symbol NSP on the TSX Venture Exchange. Naturally Splendid is a biotechnology and consumer products company focused on the global cannabis and health markets. Naturally Splendid is expanding distribution in this rapidly growing market with products currently in Canada, the USA, South Korea, Germany, and Australia. To view our comprehensive company presentation and for more information, please visit our website at naturallysplendid.com.
Welcome to the Goddard Report. Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is investigative reporter Bob Mackin, publisher of thebreaker.news. Welcome back to the show, Bob.
Thank you.
The BC throne speech, again, promises, no money figures, of course, in it. How did you react to it, and what do you think's the big deal?
It seemed to be kind of a blasé midterm kind of throne speech with some broad ideas in limited fashion and regurgitating some of the old promises from the campaign trail, and getting into some populist areas too about mobile phone charges. They want to have more transparency about mobile phone charges, and they're back on the crusade against ticket bots and predatory ticket scalping. We'll see that the devil's in details, like everything that governments do. It doesn't matter which party it is, the devil's always in the details. Throne speeches are never that detailed, and they often do include a lot of vagaries. They include, they force us to kind of read the tea leaves to see what kind of legislation will be coming down the pike. But those are some of the key themes. They're still trying to push their affordability themes, even though they have raised taxes here and there. They are, of course, increasing spending. They're going to have a budget next week, which will tell us more about that. They said, of course, they're going to do more on the first phase of the BC Hydro review. They're still trying to put out the dumpster fire at ICBC. They recommitted to the whole principle of universal low-cost car insurance. So it doesn't sound like they're going to be doing anything terribly radical from those standpoints. Of course, they talked about their Clean BC environmental platform, and they did what they had to do right near the end, the climax of the whole speech, about 14 and a half minutes. That was read by Lieutenant Governor Janet Austin yesterday at the legislature. The climax of the whole speech was about new transparency and accountability measures that are on their way in response to the Pluckus report on corruption of the BC Legislature. Of course, last week, Government House Leader Mike Farnworth said that the open letter from the three watchdogs, the Information Commissioner, Merit Commissioner, and Ombudsperson, who want merit hiring in the legislature, they want a whistleblower protection in the legislature, and they want the legislature to be finally under the Freedom of Information law. Farnworth said last week that that's going to go ahead, and the throne speech said that there will be the new transparency and accountability measures coming from this government. So there will be some changes in that aspect. Of course, ride-sharing was also another one that was talked about, or ride-hailing apps. They're still on track to introduce that here before the end of the year. We'll see what that looks like. They were questioned in question period by the opposition BC Liberals about that today, and of course the pat answer from Claire Trevino, the Transportation Minister, was, well, the Liberals, when they were in power, they had 5 years to do something, and they didn't do something. So the NDP is taking its time, and they say that they're not going to take 5 years to solve this consumer demand problem, and that they're still on track to introducing that by the end of 2019.
Isn't one of their excuses ICBC has to find a way to insure it?
Well, that is one of the aspects they're talking about, but I think the bigger problem, though, is what they want to do is have the drivers and the vehicles of ride-hailing apps fall under the same type of regulation as taxis. And I think that might be a problem for these companies, because that's the whole deal with Uber and Lyft, is that they give you better service, and they also do it for a lower price. And if they have to adhere to the same rules and regulations all the way around as the taxi companies, well, that might not make it possible for them to offer the lower price and the high level of service that they're known for around the world. So that could be a bit of a problem there that the sides will have to take care of. Of course, with the NDP, they're in an interesting position, just like the Liberals were. You've got South Asian communities in Surrey, Abbotsford, South Vancouver, who have a lot of connections to the taxi industry. Many people in those areas own taxi licenses. They're worried about those licenses being devalued or made no value whatsoever once ride-sharing comes in. And those are people at temples and other associations who have been known in the past for donating to whoever the party is in power, as well as being volunteers and, of course, sources of votes. That's one aspect of it. There's another aspect that isn't talked about as much, is that the companies have their dispatch operations, and those that are unionized by the Move Up union, which is a union that is a donor to the NDP, has donated to the NDP before the ban on corporate union donations, of course, but it's also a union that provides volunteers to the NDP. And in this new era of individual donations only, you can bet your bottom dollar that the people who do work in those union offices and those dispatch operations will be asked to reach into their pockets and donate to the party. So there are those aspects of people that feel that their jobs are at risk if the ride-hailing apps do take a foothold here. There are also reasonable questions about public safety, though, as we're seeing quite a drama that's unfolded in Ontario. Fifth Estate did a great documentary looking at the industry and looking at the SEME side. I mean, taxi industry, of course, there have been some bad actors there. It's not 100% clean itself, but the Uber and Lyft drivers in parts of North America, there have been some awful stories of sexual assault, sexual harassment. There's a story out of Toronto of a couple of passengers in an Uber that was driven by someone who lost direction, didn't know where they were going, parked at the side of a highway, and there was a massive fatal crash, and the passengers in that Uber, one of them died, another one was seriously disabled. So the mother of the victim has had a terrible time trying to get something out of Uber, to try to get Uber to take responsibility, and there's litigation there as well. So there are some reasonable questions about this, as much as there are people out there who've used these services. I've used the services. I used them in 2016 when I was in Rio covering the Olympics, and I definitely preferred taking Uber over the local taxis, just because you've got the control in your hands in your app of who you want to choose to drive you and where and when, and where you want to go. And of course, they directly bill your credit card on file, and it was an altogether better passenger experience. The drivers, you could choose some that actually were English speaking. They were friendly. They had some candies and a bottle of water there for you waiting in the car, and the car was very clean, and it got me to where I needed to go, especially in an Olympic city where transportation could sometimes be a challenge. So, these are under demand, but is the NDP doing this for the right reasons, for proper safety and regulation, or are they doing it because of pressure from friends who are donors and supporters and voters and volunteers?
We'll have more with Bob Mackin right after this.
I'm Greg Johnston, CEO of Carl Data Solutions, an industrial Internet of Things company that provides big data solutions for monitoring critical infrastructure. Carl Data offers machine learning and predictive analytics features through our cloud-based applications to deliver key asset-saving operational insights from massive amounts of data. Carl Data trades on the CSE, symbol CRL, and the Pink, symbol CDTAF. For more details on Carl Data, please visit carlsolutions.com.
Media recognition from Bloomberg, Reuters, recycling trade publications. Patented process for 100% recovery of critical metals, including cobalt, lithium, nickel, manganese, aluminum. American Manganese is focused on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. American Manganese trades on the TSX Venture, AMY, the US, AMYZF, and Frankfurt 2AM. For more information, visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Bob Mackin. Bob, it was interesting you characterized the two major parties in the BC Legislature. One likes to drag its feet, NDP lethargy, and the Liberals, a former government of waste and secrecy. Can you give us some examples of that?
Well, we're still waiting for the NDP to fulfill some key campaign promises that stem from the scandals under the BC Liberal Party that the NDP did a very good job of prosecuting while in opposition. Mostly the triple delete scandal that was brought to the fore by a whistleblower. The NDP, to their credit, have whistleblower protection now, although it doesn't go deep enough and far enough. And that's a conversation for another time, but at least they've introduced it, which the BC Liberals wouldn't. The NDP has not brought in the duty to document law that they promised in the 2017 election, and the throne speech does say that there will be some new transparency measures coming along, but I believe those are just about the legislature itself, not across government. They promised duty to document because that was the remedy that was recommended to them by the Information and Privacy Commissioner to stop the triple deleting. And within that promise, there was going to be fines for those in government who were found to be deleting or destroying documents in order to keep them out of the public realm. At the same time, there'd be a law that would mandate that the government would have to document its policymaking and its decisions, that it would have to create more records and keep those records so that we can know the pathology of decision-making. Great idea. The NDP just hasn't brought that in yet, hasn't tabled it. They've had a couple of throne speeches. This week's the third since John Horgan took power, and we aren't quite there yet. They were reacting to the Pluckus report, but not in this case. And I find it very interesting because this goes back to the last BC Liberal throne speech, the one known as the clone speech, and how difficult it was for me to get information out about some people that were hired to help. I suspected that they were hard to help, but I didn't get confirmation until I finally received the documents at late last year. And this exposed again the disaster that throne speech was by the BC Liberals who were clinging to power in June 2017, the waste and the secrecy, but also NDP lethargy, because when I filed this FOI request, it was when the NDP shortly had taken power. I wanted to find out about two contracts that were let. One was to James Tansey, a business professor from UBC. The other one to Sam Oliphant, the former press secretary to Christy Clark, who quit in 2016 to become a lobbyist. Both of these people were hired in June 2017 on no-bid, short-term contracts to offer advice. One was to offer advice on innovation and clean energy. The other one was for writing services. And in my FOI request for the contracts and correspondence, I also asked for the deliverables. What did they deliver? What did they provide under their contract before they got paid? A very simple request. One of them, Sam Oliphant, offered writing services. And funny enough, the Office of the Premier told me, sorry, we don't have deliverables. And I said, how can that be? One of these people was hired for writing services. He wrote something. He wrote something, so therefore, there is something there that I have a right to receive. Please find it for me. And I kept pestering them, and they said, well, we looked even further, we can't find anything. So then I complained to the Information and Privacy Commissioner's office, and was disappointed there because they didn't use the law as they have at their disposal. The Information and Privacy Commissioner has broad powers, including search and seizure of documents, and compelling people to testify under oath. They didn't go anywhere near there, so they shipped it off to the inquiry division, the adjudication division of the Information and Privacy Commissioner's office, and for a written inquiry. The good news is there was a government lawyer, and his name is Troy Tallifer, who actually used to work in the Information and Privacy Commissioner's office. He has experience in there, experience on files like this. He knew what to do. And he knew that it was not a good use of anyone's time for this to go to an inquiry. So he contacted some of the people involved in these contracts, and lo and behold, I was able to get the documents. It took about a year and a half from the time that these people did their work until I was actually able to daylight these documents, thanks to Mr. Talifer and his work, so that we didn't need to deal with this inquiry. What I did find out was James Tansey was paid just a little under $5,000 for his work, which wasn't just about clean energy and innovation. It was full-on advice on various aspects of the clone speech, including sections on housing. There's a couple of paragraphs there that were in a draft version of the throne speech, and he was asked by the Deputy Minister to Clark at the time about that, and about for a disaster check, and said no obvious disasters on the 3 paragraphs. There were about 9 pages that were withheld from me in the entirety because those were deemed policy advice and recommendations. And that's the sad thing, is that our government is allowed, based on the law, Freedom of Information Law, as well as court challenges to it, that the government can keep policy advice and recommendations out of the public realm, which is disappointing, because really we should know what our what the bureaucrats, especially those who are supposed to be nonpartisan, are studying and deciding on, and look at the options that they're weighing on either side before a policy is created. Well, they kept that away from me, so there was some sort of discussion between Mr. Tansey as well as the Chief of Staff, Mike MacDonald, and the Deputy Minister, Neil Sweeney. Back and forth, changes made to the throne speech that was written by someone else, by Sam Oliphant. And I eventually did get a copy of it. I suspected all along, based on the timeline that this was happening, that he was the author of the throne speech, and that turned out to be correct, because I got a copy of a draft version of the throne speech in response to my demand to see the deliverables on his side of the contract. He charged about $7,500 for that work. Nice work if he can get it. He said he worked 47 hours at $150 per hour, and wrote the clone speech, which was delivered in the legislature June 22nd, 2017. That's the one that borrowed heavily from the NDP and the Green Party election platforms, hence the name clone speech. Didn't work in the end, because the Greens decided still to support the NDP in the pivotal vote, June 29, 2017, on the confidence motion, which caused the fall of the government and the trips to Government House by Christy Clark and by John Horgan separately. And Lieutenant Governor gave the nod to John Horgan to form government, and the rest is history. But this is interesting that the NDP didn't seem to be in a rush to try to solve this problem and to shine a light on the former Premier's office and what was going on in the Premier's office, especially when I found out in these documents as well that the people in the former Premier's office, Mike MacDonald, the Chief of Staff, and Neil Sweeney, the Deputy Minister, were communicating with the contractor, James Tansey, by using private email. For Mike MacDonald, it was his consulting company email, and for Neil Sweeney, I don't know, because they censored that for privacy's sake. So there you have them also breaking another rule, because the Information Privacy Commissioner, way back in 2013, issued an order telling people that work for governments in British Columbia, don't use your private email. Because when you use your private email, it gives the citizens reasonable suspicion that you're trying to avoid the public from understanding what you're doing on the job, a job that you're paid by taxpayers to do. A negative perception. There's also some security reasons for using government email servers, is because if you're using an email server for a company like Google or Hotmail, so a free email account for your personal use, well, you kind of lose control of that data. The data that you send could be going to different countries, and it could also be hacked by people from countries that are not friendly to us, and who knows what they might want to do with that information. We've seen that with the Russians, especially in recent years, and their hacking and spearphishing. So there are so many reasons, not just for transparency and accountability, but also security's sake, to be using government email addresses if you're a public servant in British Columbia. So all of this smelled really, really badly, and it was this disastrous throne clone speech from June 2017. The NDP came to power and haven't fulfilled election promises on transparency, but I'll be watching very closely like a hawk during this legislative session, which began yesterday. I was over there in Victoria to see the throne speech, and I'll be watching closely to see if they're going to come and finally fulfill those promises, or if they're just going to pay lip service based on the very alarming conclusions of the Plecas report and the problem that we do face now with the legislature being under this cloud of corruption with the suspended clerk Craig James and the suspended Sergeant-at-Arms Gary Lenz, both under police investigation.
What did you think of their response to the claims made in the Plecas report?
Well, I read that and found a lot of holes, which goes to their credibility. I paid a visit to Craig James' house several hours after the Plecas report was released on January 21st, rang the doorbell, and Mr. James didn't come to the door, but his wife did, and said no comment, essentially, and eventually asked me to leave, which I did. And I mean, my position then was that if he was as innocent now as he was when he said in November at a press conference, why didn't he just come and face the reporter and say so in his own words? Why does he need to wait for lawyers to help him wordsmith the response? And she said he was innocent. So here we have their responses, which were leaked by someone to the Vancouver Sun. I had a source within minutes of the Sun publishing their story, giving me copies of the documents. I went through them and fact-checked them and got my story out, and leaves the reader with some things to think about. I published both of the responses, the one from Lenz and one from James, as well as my fact-checking on several key counts. You know, things that they said that were that were errant, things they didn't say at all, discrepancies, and the admissions. They admitted to a few things, a few minor things. They denied most of what Plecas had in his report, although they didn't come anywhere near attacking some of the allegations, which I found very interesting. First of all, as I had my story in the Breaker.news, both of them got the dates wrong. You'd think that they would have remembered that November 20th was the day that they were suspended by the legislature in a unanimous vote and then walked off the grounds. You'd think that November 20th would be tattooed in their minds, but no. They both said it was November 21st. I thought that was rather interesting that they both have the same error of date. And again, this was just not even 3 months ago. It's not ancient history at all yet. Yet they got the date wrong. Of course, the big issue of the wood splitter, which I found parked in the legislative grounds not far from the Conflict of Interest Commissioner's office. Craig James said that, he did keep it at his place, but was looking for somewhere else to put it because he didn't have space. He doesn't live in a rural property. He arranged to have the trailer stored in an RV storage facility instead of actually on the legislative grounds, even though this was supposed to be for the legislative grounds. If a tree fell, then it could be chopped up and used as firewood. But no, he kept it at his house 13 kilometers north of the legislature. That just didn't make sense either. Again, he repeated the date, November 21st, for his suspension. This was a strange situation that was brought to Darryl Plecas's attention by the Deputy Sergeant-at-Arms, who's now Acting Sergeant-at-Arms. The funny thing is, the legislature also has a tree contractor, a company called Bartlett Tree Experts, and they were actually on site January 21st when I was there. That was the day of the Legislative Assembly Management Committee meeting where the Plecas report was released. So you've got a contractor that is an expert in tree care and tree removal if storms happen, but no, Craig James thought they had to spend $13,000 in this trailer and this wood-splitting device. His story didn't really add up there. And then the same thing with the purchase of luggage in Hong Kong. He spent more than $1,100 on luggage in Hong Kong and said it was because there was actually a request by several MLAs. They wanted to have a luggage pool. So whenever they go for trips, they wanted to borrow luggage for their official travel. That doesn't quite add up either. Haven't heard of any MLAs coming forward and saying, yeah, they wanted to have a luggage pool, especially since there's no shortage of luggage stores in Victoria, which is also a major tourist destination. There was the questions of the lunches with lawyers that Craig James took either assured loading passes on BC ferries or Helijet over to Vancouver to attend, one with John Hunter and the other one Jeff Plant. John Hunter eventually became a judge in the Court of Appeal. Jeff Plant is a former Attorney General who his law firm was providing advice to Craig James in the legislature. But Craig James didn't say anything at all in his response about his meetings with Christy Clark. There were 4 of those, and the meetings at the BC Liberal headquarters just a few days before the BC Liberal election for a new leader. Didn't mention anything about that, and didn't explain about the meeting with Paul Barbeau. He said it was about dealing with art at the legislature, but that's not what it said on the expense report. The expense report said Vancouver Point Grey, and that's the name of David Eby's riding. So did Craig James say anything to Paul Barbeau or back and forth about David Eby, his riding, etc.? Paul Barbeau, for those who don't know it, is the current BC Liberal Party president. He was, at the time of the meetings with Craig James, the leader's liaison to the board of the BC Liberal Party. So a political animal there meeting with the clerk, still serious questions about that. As for the couple of the meetings with John Hunter, the lawyer who became a judge in the Court of Appeal, well, the spokesman for the Court of Appeal told me that, no, a couple of those meetings did not happen. So is Mr. James not telling the truth? Did he make a mistake in his claim forms? I don't know. He didn't go much into detail about there in his part of the report. There was also the issue in the Plecas report of Gary Lenz essentially throwing Craig James under the bus, according to Darryl Plecas, telling him that Craig James was not trustworthy and Craig James was a partisan clerk favoring the BC Liberals. And Gary Lenz gave about a paragraph of word salad, just saying that he has not had the time or opportunity to deal with the detailed recitations of conversations that Plecas said he had about the clerk's conduct, nor, frankly, do I see purpose in this, was the quote from Gary Lenz. So he didn't exactly deny, he just didn't really approach the allegation, which I found rather interesting, especially since that is a serious allegation about the partisan activities of Craig James. And he also wanted to be called a commissioner. Craig James wanted to be called a commissioner. He did admit that, and he tried to justify that because there's a law that could allow him to do that. There was the booze for Bill Barasoff, the former Speaker of the House. He denied that it was $10,000 worth of booze, but that there was a booze shipment up to Bill Barasoff, along with a desk, which was a retirement gift. So there's more to that than meets the eye. Craig James also said those $500 headphones, Bose headphones, he needed those, he said, because he has ear problems when flying from a combination of sound and cabin pressure. The noise-canceling headphones were purchased to alleviate that condition, he said. And he also denied that he ripped off the vacation pay fund. He said he works overtime, works weekends, sometimes 24/7, even when he's on the road and vacations. He has to keep an eye on what happens at the legislature, and Gary Lenz said that he worked well over 400 hours of overtime and deserved to be paid for that as well. So that'll be definitely weighed in the forensic audit to see if indeed these guys did work overtime and did deserve any extra pay beyond what they did Bill 4. Of course, there was that $257,000 retirement allowance, and Craig James distanced himself from that, saying it wasn't really his idea. The interesting part of that, though, was Kate Ryan Lloyd, who's the deputy clerk, who's now the acting clerk. She actually returned her share of that. She was paid $119,000 as part of that whole scheme for retirement allowances paid in 2012. Well, she had second thoughts, and she returned hers. But Craig James didn't return his. And there was, of course, the issue of going to custom tailor shops, especially one in London, England, called Ede and Ravenscroft, a very exclusive tailor shop, which is interesting because here in British Columbia we've got a tailor shop or two, especially in Victoria, that could do the job, and I'm sure they could sew together some very high quality material. But no, Craig James and Gary Lenz wanted it in London, where the people in Westminster have their clothes done. The interesting part of that is that relates to a story that I did about customs declarations. Did they make customs declarations when they returned to Canada after buying these items? And both Lenz and James, in their responses to Daryl Plecas, did not touch that allegation either, because Daryl Plecas said in his report that when they're preparing to fly home from the UK in December 2017, Plecas said that he bought quite a bit of scotch and was going to have to pay a fair sum in duties. And according to Plecas, quote, Mr. James replied along the lines of, do as I do, don't declare anything, end quote. Well, I did a story about that, and Canada Customs, formerly known as Canada Border Services Agency, wouldn't confirm or deny if they're investigating. They said that that's their policy. They won't confirm or deny they're investigating James or Lenz, but they did not say no. So they very well might be investigating further, so there could be other problems for Gary Lenz and Craig James with regarding their travel spending, and it might be because they didn't declare to Canada Customs as they should and pay any duties and taxes. So that's another question about the responses by these two suspended officials, the errors of omission, the errors of commission, the admissions, and some of the discrepancies. So the next meeting of the Legislative Assembly Management Committee could be as early as next week to look at these responses, and there should be another response from Daryl Plecas to these responses. So there's responses going back and forth. But at this meeting, it could be a meeting where the question of whether the legislature wants to continue to employ these two is addressed. They're officially suspended on pay with benefits. So they're getting paid not to work, and they've got full benefits. The Legislative Assembly Management Committee could decide to end that relationship altogether. So keep an eye on this scandal, and of course, both Daryl Plecas and his Chief of Staff, Alan Mullen, have said that there could be charges sooner than later, and there are people who are at risk of going to jail, politicians and staff. So this is going to be a very interesting spring session of the legislature as we see who is under the microscope. We already have seen one casualty, and that being Linda Reid, the Richmond BC Liberal MLA since 1991. She was the Speaker under Christy Clark, and she has stepped away from her Assistant Deputy Speaker role. Joan Isaacs has taken over that, and part of that was because Linda Reid was implicated in this whole scandal. When one of the BC Liberal staffers started asking questions about irregularities in her expenses, it looked like she was double charging taxpayers for transportation. When that happened, that became quite a focus in the Plecas report, because that aide was fired for asking questions, and fired for trying to do his job on behalf of the taxpayer. And so Linda Reid this week, that's one of the major stories, is no longer the Assistant Deputy Speaker, and it stems from this matter, the Plecas report about the corruption at the BC Legislature.
We'll have more with Bob Mackin right after this.
Cypress Development Corp's flagship lithium project is located just east of Albemarle's Silver Peak mine in the heart of Clayton Valley, Nevada. A 12-hole exploration drill program for lithium-enriched claystone on Cypress's 100% controlled properties is now underway. Cypress Development Corp trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol CYP, the pink CYDVF, and on Frankfurt's C1Z1. For more information, please visit our website, cypressdevelopmentcorp.com.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Bob Mackin. Bob, what's your take on the W5 story about rampant money laundering in BC?
Well, it's just more shocking evidence of what is happening here in British Columbia, especially when you've got a whistleblower, Ross Alderson, the anti-money laundering manager for the BC Lottery Corporation, who quit in late 2017. He couldn't stomach working there anymore, especially after he tried to do his job and raise the red flags. So W5 has, again, brought national limelight to a very damning, embarrassing situation here in British Columbia that was allowed to fester under the BC Liberal government. The NDP has patted itself on the back for taking charge of this and trying to solve it, but at the same time, there's a campaign by people that are even inside the NDP wanting John Horgan and David Eby to call a public inquiry to get to the bottom of this and get some accountability. Horgan right now is reluctant to do so because he just is worried that it'll be, quote, years and years of hearings and mountains of legal bills. That's his line, and he's sticking to it. But leaving the door open, there's a couple of reports that are due in the spring, including a second report by Peter German, former Western Canada RCMP commissioner, who now is an academic expert on money laundering. Those two reports, Horgan says, will inform the NDP's decision, and says that if there's a need for public inquiry, if those reports identify that path is the only path available to finally get the definitive answers, then they will go forward with it. But he would rather stay on this track and have these experts do the reports that can help the government make more immediate changes, administrative changes, instead of going all the way with a public inquiry. That's not something that's sitting well with a variety of people. The mayor of Port Coquitlam, Brad West, has been quite outspoken on this matter. Richmond City Council voted to ask the provincial government to do the public inquiry. Same with City of Vancouver. We're getting calls from other levels of government, municipal governments, for the NDP government to go ahead and do a public inquiry, because this is a problem that has affected municipal halls, definitely, where they've seen money laundering in local housing, and some of that money laundering, that money could have gone into the coffers at city halls, the proceeds of crime. And some of these city halls, like the one in Richmond especially, as well as Vancouver City Hall, do have relationships with local casinos and receive casino royalties. So money, dirty money that went into the casinos that also touched the real estate industry and also touched the illicit drug trade, some of those profits came into the coffers of our municipal councils, and they can't be pleased by the optics of that they were a beneficiary of this money laundering. So right now we're waiting for these reports. We're also waiting for the civil forfeiture to go ahead on some of the properties that were involved in other scandals. We are still learning more about the whole collapse of the Silver International prosecution, the Project E-Pirate busts that the RCMP did on this underground bank, which was involved in loan sharking for River Rock Casino patrons, and that maybe $2 billion a year was going through local casinos to be washed and wound up into the real estate industry. So, I think there's going to be more headlines to come, and there's going to be just more voices to be added to the fray to push John Horgan and David Eby into that situation to call a public inquiry, get to the bottom of this. We've seen what happened in Quebec with the Charbonneau Commission. that was quite thorough, and it even led to some politicians being marched off to jail. That was a question I had to John Horgan after the throne speech in Victoria at the legislature was, even though there is support within the NDP for a public inquiry, there seems to be some reluctance on the behalf of the Premier. And I asked, was it because of the possibility that his own Chief of Staff, Jeff Meigs, and members of the former Vision Vancouver City Council would have to testify if there was a public inquiry like Charbonneau? Or is there some reluctance by Horgan himself? He was, for a short time, a consultant who worked on a campaign to lift a moratorium on slot machines in Vancouver. Now you can say this now, near the turn of the century, it was quite a while ago, was back when there was quite a debate here in Vancouver about adding slot machines to Hastings Racecourse. Horgan, after he had finished working in the provincial government, before he went back into politics as an MLA, did have a consultancy that did advise on the proponents of expanding gambling in Vancouver. But he says that that was 15 years ago, and what he did as a consultant 15 years ago really has no bearing on the situation today, he said. And he chalked it up to more incompetence than conspiracy when it comes to what happened in the expansion of gambling and money laundering here in Vancouver. So he kind of brushed that question off. But it was a reasonable question, I think, because there's people within his own party who suggested that there's some in his party, some in his own office, that are scared of being collateral damage. Even though, and he's absolutely true, that much of this problem happened during the 16 years that the BC Liberals were in power. They were the ones that broke a promise, the 2001 campaign promise, key promise, to end expansion of gambling, because the NDP was pushing for more gambling in the 1990s, more casinos. Well, the Liberals came into power, and they said, no, we're going to end the expansion of gambling. Well, they did the absolute opposite and expanded gambling and completely changed the business model here in British Columbia to the point where it became a massive conflict of interest. You had the government as a partner of the casino industry which loved to build bigger and better casinos and spend money on construction companies and buy real estate, and bring even bigger profits and be part of the tourism industry. Everyone was smiling because the profits from the BC Lottery Corporation were pumped back into general revenue, and that gave the Liberals a bit of breathing room because they didn't have to raise taxes higher. So this was, quite a grand scheme that the Liberals cooked up back in it was around 2003, 2004 when they changed the business model for casinos, business model for gambling in BC. They thought it was going to be a case of, rising tide lifts all boats. Well, look what happened 16 years later. We find out that those boats are filled with all sorts of unsavory individuals who have connections to the illicit drug trade and organized crime on both sides of the Pacific. And now the NDP is left to clean it up, and it's really an argument about how to clean it up. Now, Horgan's way is to have experts study it, give recommendations, and find evidence to give to the police to do some quick investigations, relatively quick, instead of doing the Quebec-style, Charbonneau Commission-style inquiry, which would call witnesses and have testimony and be quite dramatic. And in the long run, based on what's happened in Quebec, might be the better way to go. But Horgan says that in a government with limited resources and needs all over the place in healthcare and education, he says he can't tolerate the idea of making lawyers even richer than they are.
Bob, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thank you.
My guest has been Bob Mackin, publisher of thebreaker.ca. If you have any questions for Bob or any of our other guests, you can send them to info@housestreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. The Goddard Report is available online and mobile at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. The Goddard Report is a production of House Street Media Incorporated.